Well, good morning. How's everybody doing today? That's good. Wasn't that video amazing? Yeah, this has been, let's do a big applause. Yes. The past couple of weeks, as we've gone through this series, Be Rich, has been absolutely inspiring. And it's been incredible to see the generosity of this church, not just displayed in the money given, but also displayed in the willingness that we have to serve. And as Jennifer said, today we're going to be wrapping up and we're going to talk about what it means to love. And if you've been gone the last couple weeks, if you're just here this weekend, you're not really sure what this whole Be Rich thing is about, just want to take a second just to catch you up. Really the concept, the idea of Be Rich came from words that the Apostle Paul, who's one of the early leaders of the church, really credited with writing 2/3 of the New Testament. It's words that Paul wrote to a dear friend of his, Timothy. And this is what Paul says in 1 Timothy in chapter 6. He says, "Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share." That we're to be the kind of people who are rich. And that's played out in the resources that we unleash. It's played out in the time that we're willing to give, but it's also played out in our willingness to share, which I think is directly tied to their capacity to love. And like you've already seen, the video already showed you some of what's already happened. But I just want to take a second just to catch everybody up. So far, through a one-time donation to Be Rich, we've been able to collect over $20,000 to be distributed to organizations here in our community. And like I said, if you haven't been around, the great thing is you could still give. It's a one-time gift. We're not asking you to give monthly. We're asking you to give one time, $39.95 or more. And our promise to you is 100% of everything you give will go directly to a nonprofit doing some incredible work in our community. And so if you would like to do that, I would encourage you to do that. You can go to lakesawyerchurch.org, and you'll see right on the homepage there it says, give financially to Be Rich. You can click it and give, and our promise is we'll give it away. Last week, we talked about serving, and that we want to be the kind of people, the church that is willing to go and not just give financially to these organizations, but really provide what they need so desperately, which is volunteer support. Like, we get an opportunity to go out and to be the hands and feet of Jesus in this community. And 140 of you filled those spots, signed up to serve, and we're incredibly grateful for you for doing that, for taking the time to help impact one of these communities. Now, one of the things that I said really early on in this series is for this, we don't have any sort of numerical goal. Like, we're not trying to raise a certain dollar amount. What our goal is a participation goal. That we really feel like as a church, we want not just some of us, but collectively all of us to be the hands and feet of Jesus and to impact the places in the communities that God has placed us in. And so even though we celebrate that 140 people signed up to fill one of those volunteer opportunities, the reality is that's only 25% of the people that we have here. And I realize that so many of you, we have an incredible church that serves in so many ways to make our children's ministry happen, to make what happens here on the stage happen, to everything in this room, our greeters. Really, we, just like all these organizations, function on volunteer support. But I want to say that this is an above and beyond opportunity. And that all we're asking for is that you would be willing over the next couple months to commit 1 or 2 hours to help one of these organizations. And so if you're new here and you haven't signed up, or if you just didn't sign up last week, we would love for you to do that, that we would 100% of us lock arms together to make an impact in our community. We do that? Yeah. Some people are like, oh no, I don't want to serve. And if you served or you signed up to serve and you did it in the week, also want to make sure you know that we have some Lake Sawyer t-shirts there for you in the back on your way out. You can stop by and grab those shirts on your way out. This morning, we're going to talk about love. And like I said, I really believe our willingness to share is directly tied to the capacity that we have to love. And it's something that I've come to kind of realize in my life as I've gotten older. It's something that I see pretty just obvious in my kids. My kids are really good at sharing with who they love. Maybe if you got kids, you've seen that, or grandkids, you've seen that in them as well. Last week, we were in California for my sister's wedding. It was a super exciting, great wedding. The day after the wedding, some of our family who'd kind of gathered from all across the U.S. got together to go out to lunch. And it was fun. My sister and her husband came and joined us. It was a great thing. And we're eating our meal together, and everyone's kind of scattered around the table. And I noticed as the meal is about to wrap up, the waitress walks out with 2 large Oreo milkshakes for my girls. And the moment I see the waitress walk out with them, I'm trying to think, how am I going to get some of that milkshake? And the truth is, you'd be thinking the same thing. But here's the thing, I know my kids. And I know that if I just jump on them right then and there, there's no way they're going to share their milkshake with me. I have to let them experience it a little bit, let them enjoy it, and then I'll have my opportunity. So sure enough, I buy my time, and when I feel like they've had just enough, I go up to them and I ask them, I said, would you guys be willing to share with Daddy some of your milkshake? And without even thinking, both of them said yes. And so I take a sip of one kid's milkshake, I take a sip of the other kid's milkshake, I go back and I sit down. And my dad sees all of this happening. And my dad's thinking, wait a second, I want some milkshake too. So my dad gets up and he walks over to the girls and he looks at both of them and he says, hey, can G-Paw have some of your milkshake? And the girls kind of look at him, a little more hesitation. But they say, yeah, G-Paw, you can have some of our milkshake. So my dad drinks a little bit of one kid's milkshake and then the other kid's milkshake, and he goes and sits back down. Now, my brother-in-law, Steve, who's been in the family now for 12 hours, thinks, I want in on this. And so he walks over to the girls, he looks at them, and he says, hey, he's leveraging the title. Can Uncle Steve have a sip of your milkshake? And both girls looked at him, didn't hesitate, just said no. They hadn't earned the right yet. He hadn't earned the right yet. He wasn't in the family enough, right? Here's the point. It is easy to share. It is easy to extend love to the people that we know, the people that we love, the people that we care about. But it's harder to extend love to people we don't. It's harder to extend love to people who are different than we are. But the reality is, Jesus tells us that we don't get to choose. We don't have an option when it comes to who we love. This is what he says in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 46. He says, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? If you just love the people who love you, what kind of reward do you expect to get? Even the tax collectors do that. Now, here's probably something that doesn't need to be said. Tax collectors are despised. They're despised then, let's be honest, the IRS is despised today. Tax collectors are universally hated. And no one would want to be associated with a tax collector. No one would want to be considered to be in the same boat as a tax collector, which is part of the reason why there was such a scandal when Jesus decided to spend a day with a tax collector named Zacchaeus. And now suddenly, as Jesus is teaching this large crowd here in Matthew 5, he's insinuating that if you're going to be the kind of people that are only spending time, who only love the people just like you, then you're no better than the people who you despise. And Jesus often does this. He just doubles down. He kind of restates the same thing to make sure everyone is abundantly clear to his point. So he continues in verse 47. This is what Jesus says. He says, if you only greet your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Again, very similar statement to his first. He's saying if you only say hello, if you only greet, if you only give hugs to the people who are like you, then what makes you any different? Now, honest moment. This plays out every single weekend at church. How many of us showed up this morning, came to the same seats we always sit in, our assigned seating? Whenever I see someone in the grocery store or something, I'll be like, I haven't seen you at church. How do you know? You always sit in the same seat. It's not hard. It's true. So we come to church, and then you know what we do? We find the people we know, and we go say hi to them. We say hello, and we give them a hug, and we ask them about their week. And you know what we do with the people we don't know? We ignore them. They're not part of our world. And so we don't take the next step. We don't extend ourselves to say hello to people who are different. And that's exactly Jesus' point. And he says, look, if you're going to behave like that, and again, he's talking to the crowd of people, he says, you're no different than pagans. Now, that term pagan, you've probably heard that term before. Maybe you've actually been called that term before, but it probably needs to be defined a little bit. And in the biblical context, a pagan is someone who doesn't have a relationship with the God of Israel, with the God of this creation. And it's also someone who would likely be considered to be a Gentile. And a Gentile is really anyone who isn't Jewish. And so all of us would be Gentiles. And so Jesus is saying, look, if you're going to be the kind of people that don't love people that are different than you, if you're going to be the kind of person who doesn't greet or say hello to someone who's different than you, then you are no better than the very people that you despise. That you are just like them. And those words from Jesus, as the crowd is hearing it, cuts to the heart. It impacts those who are hearing it, and it should impact us as well. You see, Jesus is calling his followers to something bigger, something completely different than they've ever experienced. He's calling them to a radical movement of love. And Jesus would go on to say that love wouldn't just be something that his people are known for. Jesus would actually say is that love would be the defining characteristic of his followers. This is what he says in John chapter 13, beginning in verse 34. He says, "A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." Jesus says, it's a new command that I give you. Now, a command is a requirement. A command isn't a suggestion. Jesus isn't saying, hey, it would be really nice if you would be the kind of people who would love one another. He's saying the expectation is that his followers would be marked by this radical movement of love. It wouldn't just be a characteristic, that it would be their trademark. And Jesus goes on, this is what he says in verse 35. He says, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. I want you to just think about that for a second. Jesus doesn't say, by your knowledge of his word, people will know you're his disciples. He doesn't say, by your willingness to do good deeds, people will know you're his disciples. He says, it's by your willingness to love one another that people will know, that the world will know that we are his followers. Now, I want to be clear, when Jesus says these words, he's speaking them to his apostles, the 12 closest followers that he has. He's telling them, he's saying, look, your capacity, your ability to love one another, your ability to stay united together, even as the events of the coming days, weeks, and months are about to unfold, even as Jesus goes to the cross and is put in the tomb and raises from the dead and ascends up to heaven through this season of incredible, difficult times, the call from Jesus to the apostles was to stay united together, to be people of love. And even though, again, it was spoken directly to them, the application is universal. That we are called today to be the kind of people who are willing to love one another. That this church should be known by its radical movement of love, not just for one another, but for the world around it. Because that's the other thing you see in the life of Jesus. Like, as you read through the teachings in the life of Jesus, one thing it becomes a very clear is that Jesus is constantly extending and broadening the people that are worthy of his love. It's to everyone. And so we need to not just love each other, but we need to be the kind of people who are willing to love the world around us. And so this morning, as we wrap up Be Rich, I want to talk about some very specific ways that we're going to do that. Some ways that we can go about loving people that are different than us, loving people beyond the walls of this church, loving our community. And here's what I'd say. It's not as difficult as we think it is. And sometimes we get caught up like, well, who are we supposed to love? What does that look like? And so we're just going to start very simply and give you practical steps on how you can go about loving the people that God has put around you. And the first thing is the solution to that question, who do we love? The answer to it is that they're right outside. Like they're next door. Like they're literally your neighbors. If we're looking for who we are called to love, then a great place to start is our neighbors. I mean, the reality is I don't believe that God put me where I live by accident. That God didn't put you where you live by accident. That God puts you in your community, in your home, in your neighborhood, very strategically to be a witness. To be willing to share your hope and your faith, to be willing to extend love to the people that God has placed around you. But the reality is, most of us have no idea who our neighbors are. Maybe we know one, maybe we know two, but most of us don't really know who are the people that God has placed around us. This past summer, I read a book called The Art of Neighboring, and it really inspired me and challenged me with some of these ideas. And one of the images that is used in the book I want to share with you, just go ahead and put it on the screen right now, is called the block map. And it asks the question, who is your neighbor? If we're going to love people, loving our neighbors is a great place to start. Most of them are very different than we are. The reality or the question then is, who are our neighbors? And just really quickly, can you guys name the name of your neighbors in all those houses that surround your house, assuming your house is yellow? By a show of hands, who can name all of their neighbors? Well done. Seriously, the statistic is 90% of Americans couldn't name their neighbors that directly surround their home. 90% of people couldn't do it. Now, the next step is not just, could you name your neighbors? The question is, could you actually tell me one significant thing about their life? Like what they do for a living, what their hobbies are, what their favorite movie is, or how many kids they have. Like, could you tell me something about their life? And at that point, with those two questions, 97% of people couldn't say yes. The reality is overwhelmingly, we don't know who our neighbors are. We don't know the people that God has placed around us. And if we want to start a radical movement of love, then these houses that surround where we live is the best place to start. And remember, this is not just a suggestion to love. It's something that Jesus commands us to do. And so as we begin to wrap our minds and our heads around what does it look like for us to love our neighbors, some of you are probably thinking in this moment, but even that neighbor? We all have that neighbor. You know, the one that is not really out much, the one who you really wish would do a better job of keeping their yard put together, rake their leaves. I can't preach it. I'm that neighbor. I'm a good neighbor. But I mean, I get in my neighborhood, it's like the pastor. We all have that neighbor, right? And so we start to wonder ourselves, like, okay, I might reach some of those people around me, but I don't really want to reach that person. Like, do I have to reach that person? Do I have to be willing to extend love to that kind of awkward neighbor that I'd rather not talk to? The answer is, quite honestly, yes. Unless you can find for me one instance where Jesus completely walked away or ignored someone who society said was less than desirable. And my guess is you're not going to find it because Jesus didn't do it. Because Jesus was willing to engage, no matter how awkward or undesirable they were, the people that were in his path. So if we consider ourselves Christ followers, then we must be willing to engage as well. So how do we go about it? How do we begin? For some of you, I'm very impressed that you can name those neighbors. Some of you, you even know some of the things about their lives. For some of us who don't know anything about our neighbors, how do we begin to engage with those people? Again, the people that God has placed around us so that we can start this movement of radical love. And maybe you're thinking this is like the most awkward or weird thing ever, because for some of you, you lived at your house for 10 years or 20 years. Maybe you've lived there for 5 years and you've never got to know their name. You're thinking, what am I just supposed to do? Like walk over to their house and say, hey, I know I've lived next to you for 15 years, but I don't know your name. My name is Mike. I'd love to meet you. And the answer is yes. Like that's exactly what you're supposed to do. And here's the thing, just tell them. Tell them, say, hey, I realize I haven't been a great neighbor. I haven't been as friendly and as kind as I should, and I'm just coming to grips with that, and so I just wanted to make sure I got to know everyone in our community. People love authenticity. Just be honest. Hey, I just want to get to know you. Just do me a favor, though. Don't walk over to your neighbor's house and introduce yourself and then say, my pastor made me do this, so like, I'm here because he made, like, I'm not making you do anything. I promise, I'm not making you do this. I'm not trying to guilt you into doing this. I'm just saying it's what Jesus tells you to do. So it's not me, it's Jesus. Be willing to walk over. Be willing to knock on the door of someone that you don't know and say hello. Introduce yourself. Ask if there's anything they need. I promise you, as awkward as that moment is, it will be worth the awkwardness. Those steps that you take across the street or next door will be worth the effort that's involved in them. And I know that some of you at this point are terrified because you're thinking, I'm not built for this. Like, I'm an introvert. I don't want to do this. Some of you are like, this is the greatest sermon ever. I can't wait to go home. You already know all your neighbors for the extroverts there. But then we start to go to the second piece, right? Like if we're going to be called to love our neighbor, if we're going to call to engage with them, we immediately begin to think about the second what if. And that is simply this: time. We start to think, well, I don't have enough time. Yeah, this is great. I understand that Jesus calls us to love our neighbors, but like I don't have enough time to do this. And so you can't even begin to wrap your mind around how you go about doing this in a very tangible way, how you can go about loving your neighbor. And I get it, but here's some of the realities with time. Here's what we all know. Time is finite. Like there's only so much time. There's only so much time in a day. There's only so much time in a week or in a month, in a year. We can't create more time, right? Except for time change weekend. Then God creates for us an hour. That we get more time then. Not the next one. When we fall, I don't know, whatever. Anyways. The reality then, if we can't create more time, we have to begin to look at the time we have and make tough decisions about how we prioritize the time that we have. And the truth is, if you're here this morning and you consider yourself a Christ follower, you're just as busy as everybody else, no doubt. But if you consider yourself a Christ follower, your priorities should be different. You should be willing to wrap your priorities, to take the time that you have and leverage that to the priorities of Jesus, to be about those things. And it's not going to take a complete rebuilding of your priorities or rebuilding of your time schedule to do some of this. Like if time is really the issue, all you need to do is figure out how just to get a little bit, maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour to go meet your neighbors. And here's a very simple way. Don't go on social media for a day. Like for one day, could you choose not to go on social media and use that to go meet your neighbors? Or maybe something else. This past week, Disney Plus came out. And I don't know about you, me, I'm like reliving my childhood through Disney Plus. Just don't do that one night. And then you've just bought yourself 17 hours. Something, my math's really bad. What if we took just something, we looked at our schedule, we looked at our priorities, we were willing to remove something for one night to create time to do something greater, to do the things that Jesus has commanded and called us to do. This is what Jesus says in John chapter 10 and verse 10. He says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Jesus says that he has come so that we who place our lives, our faith in him will have life to the full. Now, what that doesn't mean is that we have lives with full schedules. That we have lives full of all these obligations. Like, I think that's sometimes what we think it is. We think, okay, well, the fullness of life is about being busy. We sometimes take our busyness and we wear it as a badge of pride. Like, look at all the things that I'm doing. Look at all the things that I have going on. Look at my schedule. There's no open spaces anywhere. Like, somehow that makes us important. But the reality is that is in no way, shape, or form the kind of life that Jesus called us to. The thing I love about Jesus is no matter how busy he was, no matter how much he had going on, literally saving humanity, he found the time to spend with his Father. He found time to focus on what matters most. The fullness of life that Jesus is talking about has nothing to do with our schedules. It has to do with a life that is aligned with the things of God. If you want to live full lives, if you want to live lives that just the world looks at and says, there's something different about that person. There's something that they have that I want in my life. I promise you, it's not because of what you accomplish in the workplace. It's because what you accomplish being the hands and feet of Jesus. How can you create a little bit of time to rearrange your priorities around Jesus and experience the fullness of life? John Ortberg, who's a pastor and a writer, he wrote these words in his book, The Life You've Always Wanted. He says, love and hurry are fundamentally incompatible. Love always takes time, and time is one thing hurried people don't have. Time is one thing hurried people don't have. If you are going to be a person of love, if you're going to be the kind of person that gets to know their neighbors, you've got to figure out how to reprioritize your time. Now, maybe some of you at this point are feeling a little overwhelmed because you see that block map, you see all those houses around you, you realize how few of them you actually know the names of, and you're thinking suddenly you've got to do all of this week. And the answer is you don't. I'm not trying to overwhelm you. I'm not trying to tell you that you need to go home starting today and by next Sunday get to know all of your neighbors. But I am saying, could you possibly get to know one neighbor? Like just one person in your community, one person who lives around you. Now let me just clarify that. If we know our neighbors, which a lot of us probably know one neighbor, we probably know the only other Christian that lives around us. Because it's comfortable, because it's natural, right? Because like attracts like. And so when I say go engage with a neighbor, I'm not talking about that neighbor. I'm not talking about the neighbor who's just like you, who believes what you believe. That would be simple. But again, Jesus says, we're not after simple. Instead, what if this week you could find one neighbor around you who is different than you? Who doesn't believe what you believe, who doesn't come to church at Lake Sawyer or some other church in this community, who doesn't have a relationship with God. What if you could leverage this week to get to know that neighbor and get to know their story, get to know their heart? And in that, I promise you, you will uncover ways that you can begin to love that neighbor. But it doesn't happen overnight. You're not going to do this all by tomorrow. It's literally baby steps. Have you guys seen the movie What About Bob? Yeah, some of us. I'm not saying you should. It's just a funny movie. But in the movie What About Bob, the character Bob, he's trying to make some changes in his life, and all of it is baby steps. It's just this great scene as he's literally walking out of his psychologist's office, and to the elevator, he's like, baby steps to the door, baby steps open the door, baby steps down the hallway, baby steps to the elevator, baby steps in the elevator, baby steps down the elevator. He thinks of life one step at a time. And what I would say is, you do this, think baby steps. Don't think of all that you have to accomplish to get to where you want to be, to get to a real meaningful relationship. Just start with a baby step. Literally open your door, walk outside, and walk next door. And as I say that, I know like people are like, well, how do I know which door to walk to? Like, how do I know what am I going to say? How do I, like, we get all these questions and thoughts, and they almost like paralyze us, because until we have all the answers, we just don't know what to do. Like, God, is this the neighbor you want me to talk to? Or is it this neighbor? Like, I'm just going to wait and until there's a sunny day in Seattle, then I'll know the answer of who I'm supposed to talk to. Very strategic how we trick God, don't we? I need 5 sunny days in a row, God, and then I know that this is of you. Don't overthink it. Literally, this is one of my favorite passages in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 16, this is what Paul says. This is what we read. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. What I love so much about that verse, and what I love so much about the heart of Paul is not waiting. Paul is not over-spiritualizing this. Paul is on a missionary journey, and he's just going to go. He's going to go, he's going to keep going, and if God doesn't want him to go somewhere, God will give him the no. But until God gives him the no, which happens in the next verse, and directs him where to go next, he just goes. He goes. He knows that there's people everywhere that need Jesus. There's people everywhere that need to hear about the hope and the message of Jesus. And so he's just going to go. And that same mentality should be us as well. Baby steps out the door. Baby steps next door. Doesn't matter which one. Just pick one. If God doesn't want you to go next door, I promise you'll probably trip and break your nose along the way. It's okay. Just go. Meet a neighbor. Don't overthink this. If we are going to start a radical movement of love, then the truth is it starts next door. It starts with our neighbors. And as we wrap up this Be Rich series, we wanted to make this as easy as possible for you. So literally when you came in, you sat down on a seat and this piece of paper was on that seat. And I want you to grab it for a second because I want us to look at it together. The whole idea behind this piece of paper is that we are to be the kind of church that puts love into action. And you'll see on the backside here, there's a couple categories, a couple ways. Like, these are just some things that we've put before you to maybe spark an idea that would give you a tangible way to help you love a neighbor. So the first one, time. Think about your upcoming week. Is there something on your schedule which you can invite a neighbor to join you? Grocery shopping, movies, share a meal, game night, go for a drive, have coffee, watch a sports game. Like, could you invite a neighbor over next week to watch the Seahawks game? Like, could you leverage some of the time, reprioritize that time to focus on people who don't yet know Jesus and invite them over? Maybe that's a way that you love a neighbor this week. Number 2, surprises. Do something to surprise a neighbor. Take their garbage cans in for them, double your favorite meal recipe and share it. Leave some flowers on a doorstep with an encouraging note. Like, these are some ways that you can just surprise your neighbor to do something kind and generous for them. Last one, meet a neighbor. Do you have a new neighbor? Most of us do. Like, we live in a growing community. People are moving in all the time. At any given time, there's like 4 houses for sale in my neighborhood. I constantly have new neighbors. Do you know all your neighbors? Be intentional in connecting with someone new. Knock on a door this week and introduce yourself to a family or person that you haven't met before. What is one specific, strategic thing that you can do to love someone in your community this week, to love a neighbor, or to build a new relationship with a neighbor that you haven't yet met? And so here's what we're going to ask. On the front side of this card, we're going to ask that you would write it down. That you would take a second and you would write down the way that you plan to love someone in your community. And then I'm going to ask that you take a picture of it, because sometimes we need a picture to remind us of what we're going to do, because at the end, as we leave, right out to the back here, there's a wall that says love on it. And I'm going to ask you to take this piece of paper and pin it to the wall. And here's why I'm going to ask you to pin it to the wall. because there's something powerful in seeing together, collectively, the commitments that we're making. Like, when you're looking at this piece of paper, it's hard to imagine a radical movement of love. But when you see those commitments on a wall together, you realize that God is doing something amazing, not just in you, but in those who are sitting around you and through this church. And so I'm going to give you a few minutes here to write something on this piece of paper. Write down a way that you want to love your neighbor this week. Take a picture of it, and then I'll come back up in just a second. I'll pray, and then we can put them on the wall as we head out. When my kids leave for school, the bus stop is just right up the street from our house. And last year, every single morning we went out to the bus stop, partly because my daughter was in kindergarten and we needed to be there to put him on the bus or to take him off the bus. But this year she's in first grade and it's cold, so I don't have to go anymore. We can just kick them out the door and trust that they'll come home about 3 o'clock. It's worked so far. But every single morning, there is a group of parents that stand out there. And we know their names, but we don't know them as well as we should. And so this week, my wife and I will go out and we'll do different neighbors. And we're going to do something kind for them. We'll bake them some banana bread and distribute to them who are standing there in the morning, maybe bring out some coffee and give it to them as they wait outside for their kids to get on the bus. That's what I'm going to do. That's what I will commit to. I look forward to seeing what you commit to as well. You can take a picture of these things, and you can have that with you because, like I said, you'll be putting this on the board as you walk out. I just want to, as we wrap up, say thank you so much for being here this morning. And thank you so much for the past 3 weeks, for being the kind of church filled with the kind of people who are committed to being rich. To be rich with their resources, to be rich with their time, and to be rich in the way that they love the people that God has put around them. And I'm excited to see what God does through all of this. Is there still opportunities to give to the campaign? There's still opportunities for you to sign up to serve, and I'm excited to see what changes in your neighborhoods as you commit to love the people that God has put around you. Let me go ahead and pray, and then we'll be finished this morning. God, I thank you so much for the words of Paul and this whole concept of being rich. And I know that those words are the incredible example of who you are. That through your son Jesus, you showed us what a generous life looks like, what a life that is given away looks like. And God, I pray that we would be the kind of people who are willing to give away our lives, that we're willing to live beyond ourselves to make an impact, to do great things in the community that you've placed us in the neighborhoods that you've placed us in. God, I pray that through Lake Sawyer Church and through every church, we would see a radical movement of love impact the streets and the neighborhoods and the communities that we're a part of. Thank you for your son, Jesus, and for what he means to us. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.